Thank you, Kathy. So well deserved. At this meeting, we present the Judge A. Leon Higginbotham, Jr. Memorial Public Interest Lecture. As most of you know, Judge Higginbotham was the first African American to serve on the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, who also served as Chief Judge of the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. As a legal and civics giant and scholar, he was a lifelong champion of individual rights, with a career that spanned nearly a half a century. He was one of our own, and we are proud to present today's keynote lecture in his memory. I am now pleased to introduce our guest speaker, the Honorable Timothy K. Lewis, who will deliver the Judge A. Leon Higginbotham, Jr. Memorial Public Interest Lecture. Judge Lewis, or Tim as I affectionately call him, is counsel at my firm, Schneiderhausen, Siegel & Lewis. He serves as a mediator, arbitrator, settlement counselor, and a trial and appellate practitioner. Before entering private practice, Judge Lewis served on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. He was serving as a U.S. District Court judge for the Western District of Pennsylvania when President George H.W. Bush elevated him to the Court of Appeals in 1992. At the time of both appointments, he was the youngest federal judge in the United States. Delivering the Judge A. Leon Higginbotham, Jr. Memorial Public Interest Lecture, please welcome my good friend, the Honorable Timothy K. Lewis.
Thank you, Al. Thank you all very much. It's, of course, an honor for me to be here with so many friends, former colleagues from the bench, current colleagues, and congratulations to all of today's honorees, but especially to Kathy Carr. It's just a wonderful accomplishment over the course of many years of hard work, very important work. We are all grateful for your contribution and for what you have done. Before I begin, how about if we just take a moment to recognize and acknowledge my dear friend and colleague and the person you were all wise enough to elect as your chancellor, Al Dandridge, who's done an outstanding job. And also, before I get started, to my friend Judge McKee over here to my left, as your friend who loves you, if I should say anything today, Judge McKee, that might offend the third branch of government, at least you'll know that it comes from the very bottom of my heart, just so that you know that in advance. Back in 1975, I was a college student in Boston, and I was involved in demonstrations. The demonstrations were focused on the violence that was being visited upon black students who were trying to integrate South Boston High School. They went on for quite some time, and Gil Scott-Heron wrote a poem in which he addressed some of that violence. He wrote, "As Boston becomes Birmingham, becomes Little Rock, becomes Selma, becomes yesterday all over again." If Gil Scott-Heron were here today, he might be writing, "As Ferguson becomes Staten Island, becomes Cleveland, becomes Charleston, becomes San Francisco, becomes Chicago, becomes Baltimore, becomes yesterday all over again." And so, in this year of protest and confrontation, I'd like to just take a few moments to talk to you about values, our national values, and about redemption, and about our unending struggle to find both to save ourselves. In his collection of essays on race, Clarence Page vents his frustration with our vacuous search for race-based identity. "I started out as a colored person," he writes, "and then I was a Negro. After that, I became a black man. Later, I became an Afro-American. In a few years, I became an African-American. And today, I am a person of color. Somehow, over the course of 50 years, I have advanced from being a colored person to a person of color. So go figure, he writes. And I empathize with Brother Clarence, but right now, that strange trajectory seems petty next to the ones that are reflected in signs. 50 years ago, they read, "I am somebody." Today, they read, "Hands up, don't shoot." Today, they address an all too justifiable fear of death, while neither resisting arrest nor posing an imminent threat. Even worse, in certain communities today, children are reduced to carrying signs proclaiming that their lives actually matter. Now, it is hyperbole to suggest that nothing has changed over the course of 50 years except the wording on a sign. But we cannot escape the visceral connect between "I am somebody" and "Black Lives Matter." 50 years apart, both evince the same desperate plea simply to be respected and to be treated as a human being, even when being arrested. What we see today speaks directly to some of the ways that we have failed too many for too long. And sometimes we need such a sad commentary on our national values to return with renewed intensity to what Lincoln referred to at Gettysburg as our unfinished work. Because the work to form a more perfect union is never finished. And we are today in Black communities in this great nation hearing the echoes of a centuries-old primal scream. And it reverberates with urgency in the collective spirit of innocent and unarmed children and adults who are laying dead in the street, too often at the hands of those who are sworn to protect and serve. And so we navigate treacherous waters. And it is going to take a revolutionary force supported by thoughtful programs and thoughtful policies and thoughtful people to enable us to steer between what Reinhold Niebuhr called the Scylla of anarchy and the Charybdis of tyranny. But we have been here many times before. I was deeply moved 13 years ago as I attended a memorial service at the National Cathedral in Washington commemorating the anniversary of a ruthless attack on our country, out of which was born a new spirit, a spirit that sought to rise above petty differences to pay tribute to fundamental ideals upon which this nation was founded. And as I watched the colors paraded slowly and majestically down the aisle in the processional to the haunting refrain of bagpipes, and as I listened to Bishop Desmond Tutu speak of legacies and hope and how we keep both alive, mine were not the only tears shed in that sacred place at that sacred moment. And we grew stronger as a nation, even as we continue today to reassess and to refine our values in the wake of that response. And at this moment, and in a different context, I reflect again upon legacies, some from our profession, the relentless scholarship of Higginbotham, the vision of Charles Hamilton Houston, the courage of Marshall, the heart of Lou Pollock, the unparalleled commitment to human rights of my friend Jerry Shestak, whose wife, Marcia Rose, sits right over there to my right. I'm so happy you're here today, Marcia Rose. But I also think of William Lloyd Garrison, Ida B. Wells, Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, Bayard Rustin, Harvey Milk, Rosa Parks, These are people who refused to bend to the prevailing unjust order and who dedicated their lives to challenging inequality. Their spirit is embodied in the venerable and patriotic tradition of protest against injustice that is this country's ever-luminous beacon. And their gaze, along with many others, is fixed upon us, all of us, as we do what we must to ensure that their legacy remains intact, that their spirit remains alive, and that a tradition, and thus our common faith, becomes advanced yet again, not just by the hallowed words our nation was founded upon, but by the very honorable work we do to give full meaning to those words. I commend to you David Brooks's new book, which is called The Road to Character. Brooks focuses on the lives of some very interesting and accomplished people, many of whom we regard very highly, and he points out the one pattern that recurs in each of their lives. They had to go down in order to come up. They had to address moral crisis and confrontation and recovery to see their own nature. They had to humble themselves in self-awareness, but after they did, the beauty began. And so this is a book about values. It's about how we find them and how we lose them and how we find them again, and perhaps in doing so find ourselves again. Like most of us, at times in my life, I've lost track of my own values, and it's a painful and difficult place to be. But as Brooks notes, sometimes in order to find yourself, you have to lose yourself, and that is true. When it happens, we learn again that there is nothing, and I mean nothing, that truly introduces us to ourselves like adversity. There is no doubt that a good person and a great nation can become even better and stronger for having been, in the words of Robert Frost, acquainted with the night. But this is not new. It was known to Aeschylus 2,500 years ago when he wrote the Agamemnon. He who learns must suffer, and even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart until in our own despair and against our will comes wisdom to us through the awful grace of God. But we don't need Aeschylus to teach us that all of this transcends the individual. All of this is also true of our nation, which also loses its values from time to time. And that has been true since its founding. We continue to trudge the road to character as a nation. And the eternal question is, how much suffering must we endure before, perhaps against our will, comes wisdom to us? And as we address that question, we must remember that it is still true, as Frederick Douglass said, that power concedes nothing without a demand. That demand might come overtly, or it might come in a graceful act of dignity and courage, or it might be presented in soaring rhetoric that offers a new moral grounding and redirects our national conscience and sustains us as we go forward. Now, we are gathered today in the eternal shadow of the birthplace of our nation's promise of equality. And 52 years ago, in the searing heat of late August, a visionary stood before the country, itself sweltering in the embers of inequality, and in the most patriotic speech since Lincoln's, offered his dream of that promise's redemption. This was to become, as Senator Kennedy later called it, the civil rights movement's aria. "I Have a Dream" was an optimistic oration, but it was honest. It acknowledged the desperate circumstances that made it necessary, but it also projected a hope that influenced change from southern Mississippi to South Africa and from Berlin to Beijing. It was a nod to all that is sacred in American political and social culture. But to fully appreciate its text, one has to understand the historical context in which it was given. Because 1963, the year before Leon Higginbotham became a federal judge, was a pivotal year in the development of what Brooks refers to as our moral ecology. The year began with newly inaugurated Alabama Governor George Wallace standing on the steps of the state capitol declaring infamously, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." And not long after, Bull Connor turned his fire hoses and dogs on young students who were peacefully demonstrating against the social conditions of blacks throughout the South. Much like today, the country was outraged because of the wide embrace of a new technology, television, that allowed millions of Americans to bear moral witness to the brutality of racism. And that was followed by President Kennedy's address to the nation in which he called for civil rights legislation. And in the 10-week period following President Kennedy's address, there were 750 demonstrations in over 180 cities, which led to nearly 15,000 arrests. John Lewis writes in his biography, "There were bombings, beatings, and killings happening almost weekly. A march would be met with violence, which would cause another march that would be met with more violence, and on and on." That was the pattern. Later that year, Wallace stood in the doorway to block black students from going to college. This was followed by the murders of 4 little black girls who were bombed to death in a church in Birmingham while they attended Sunday school. Soon after that, Medgar Evers was shot in the back as he returned home from his NAACP office in Mississippi and died in his wife's arms in front of their young daughters. And of course, in November of that year, the president himself would be assassinated in Dallas. Now, we have experienced a difficult year, but that was just a smattering of the chaos and violence during an 11-month period in 1963. These were dark and difficult times, but Dr. King would not allow the darkness or the hardship to deter his vision, and we must not today. We have come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now, he said that day. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. That admonition, along with many individual acts of courage by lawyers and by judges and by legislators, people of courage in the civil rights movement, inspired a more enlightened understanding of our values and the work that we needed to do to advance them. We had been long acquainted with the night, and we were ready to change. And good people, black and white, were no longer afraid to do what was necessary. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the War on Poverty, and so much of the development of our character can be traced to that history, to that year, to that adversity, and to that moment of self-confrontation. We had navigated between the Scylla and the Charybdis, and in our own despair, we had found wisdom. In 2008, another black man would seize upon the fierce urgency of now and wrap his campaign for President of the United States around it. But today, that urgency is compounded, and it is a tragic irony, unbefitting the historic significance of his election, that our first black president presides over a nation where so many are carrying signs imploring that black lives matter. Early death, crime, unemployment, dropout, and incarceration rates in black communities throughout this country have skyrocketed. Racial profiling and other more extreme police abuses are documented again and again and again each week. The common factors are undeniable. These people are poor and they are black. One of the fundamental pillars on which this nation was founded was the acceptance of black inferiority. And despite all of the happy nonsense to the contrary, whether through unconscious bias or a backlash to changing demographics or flat-out racism, that pillar still stands in some of our offices and institutions today. The election of the first black president didn't end any of it. Nor were we helped, in my view, when 8 years ago, the Chief Justice of the United States, in reference to programs designed to redress some of this, told us that the way to end discrimination is to stop discriminating. This was a profound distortion and a determined misuse of American history and present-day reality. And courts should not resort to blind formalisms that convert what should be the wise and flexible and thoughtful application of the law to some perverse algebra that takes place outside the realm of reality. I would like to believe that we are better than that, and perhaps the Chief Justice might wish to spend a little more time in the hood before offering his pronouncements on how to end discrimination. So what might our active moral witness yield in 2015? How can we contribute in this urgent moment? Well, the first thing that we need to remember is that the law is about values, and sometimes these values become misplaced. But we can advocate for much needed and meaningful criminal justice reform, beginning with sentencing reform, but including the right to counsel, prosecutorial overreach, prison reform, and a horrendously failed war on drugs. Each of these affects the status and the well-being of many of the people carrying those signs. And whether we agree with them or not, at least we can appreciate their humanity and recognize them and understand their plight and write an op-ed to a senator or a state senator, U.S. senator, whatever, or a member of Congress. Use your well-trained lawyerly voice. And while you're at it, write about the Paycheck Fairness Act, which has been reintroduced and is now pending to ensure that women workers are not shortchanged and to promote fair and stable family incomes. White women make 78 cents for every dollar that men make. Black women make 64 cents, and it's even worse for Latinas. Pay discrimination is real, it is dehumanizing, and it has to stop. We should support the End Racial Profiling Act, which has also been reintroduced. We need that. Racial profiling robs people's dignity, and frankly, it is anybody who's ever worked in law enforcement, as I have, knows that it is a hindrance to effective law enforcement. We can pressure our senators to enact asset forfeiture reform. These warrantless abuses have to stop. We should tell civic and political leaders that if they want your law firm's money and support or your vote, they need to join a national call to action for a summer youth employment program, if not this year, then next year, because our response to the massive bank crisis was the TARP. But in inner cities throughout this country, including here in Philadelphia, we still have 15, 20, and up to 40% unemployment. And these are places that desperately need infrastructure repair. I mean, how is it that we can rebuild Baghdad and Kandahar, but we can't rebuild Chicago and Baltimore and West Philadelphia? We need to advocate for police reform. Mayors and police chiefs and prosecutors need to take a close look at themselves, and they need to ask if they honestly have the capacity to discipline police officers. We cannot continue to have the police investigating themselves. The city of Chicago just paid over $5 million to victims who were tortured to extract confessions. It was established that it was systematic and racially motivated, and it affected over 100 black men. But it took way too long because of police investigating themselves. There are too many mechanisms in place for abuse. Like many of you, I am leaving here to return to my office to bill time. But I will also spend a little time on a pro bono matter. Pro bono work is not something that you do out of the goodness of your heart. It is a debt that you are repaying for the privilege of being a lawyer. And you should pay it until it hurts. Firms that can afford it should increase their minimum requirements for this work. There is plenty to do, and good things will come your way for doing it. And of course, we must address our own massive failure at achieving pluralism and diversity within our own ranks and at our law firms. We are the least diverse profession in the nation. And that is shameful. That's just shameful. We deprive ourselves, we deprive our values, we deprive our economic growth, and we deprive our clients by failing to recognize that multiculturalism, or pluralism without walls, is the present and it is the future. It's our world. So these are just some of the many professional, political, and institutional things that we can do. As individuals, as lawyers, and as a nation, we are splendidly talented and we are deeply flawed. But as long as we struggle against our own weaknesses and join together to do so on behalf of our country and on behalf of our profession, we will find redemption again and again. And that is humbling, but it's also our unfinished work. Because in this ongoing struggle to define our national identity, which is the hallmark of a free people in a constitutional democracy, each of us counts, in the words of James Weldon Johnson, as a hope that the present has brought us. And I believe that Leon Higginbotham, with whom I served and who was my friend, looking down upon us from perfection as we pursue this endeavor, might summon the necessary revolutionary force that I referred to earlier, the single most powerful force known to humankind, by quoting two of the greatest songwriters of the 20th century. And then, in his mellifluous resonance, he might ask us to remember this. And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. God bless you all, and thank you for having me.
We don't. That's why we end it. So that was the showstopper. We are now adjourned.